All right, I think we'll get going. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar. On behalf of RSNA, thank you for joining us from Novelty to Necessity, Optimizing AI Access, Use, and Impact with RSNA. Also, thank you to Nuance Communications for sponsoring today's webinar. This webinar is one of the many ways RSNA is reaching the radiology community to provide education and resources. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for free in the RSNA Online Learning Center, as well as the RSNA's YouTube channel. Please be sure to check those out. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Hawk. I am the Director of Innovation Engagement for Radiology Partners and also a Clinical Assistant Professor for Stanford Nuclear Medicine. And it's my great honor and pleasure to be moderating this discussion today. With us today, we also have fantastic guests, Dr. Sheela Agarwal and Dr. Sriyesh Krishnan. Before our panelists introduce themselves, though, there are a few housekeeping items to review. Here's the RSNA disclaimer. Please take a moment to read it by yourself. Now I'm going to turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Welcome, Dr. Agarwal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hawk. My name is Sheela Agarwal. I am Chief Medical Information Officer for Diagnostics at Nuance Communications, and I'm also a practicing radiologist at Lenox Hill Radiology in New York City. I'm super excited to be here and, think this is such an important and relevant topic today. So I'm just really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Krishnan.
Thanks, Dr. Hawk. So my name is Sriyesh Krishnan. I am the Vice Chair for Clinical Operations at Greensboro Radiology in North Carolina. I'm also the Director of Innovation Development for our larger practice radiology partners, and I'm a practicing body imager. So I'm also excited to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. And I use AI both as a clinical physician. I also evaluate AI for both of our practices. And I've had the opportunity to talk to lots of healthcare executives, and so I can see it from their perspective as well. So excited to talk about it from all perspectives today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So moving into it, I'd like to set the stage a little bit and begin our discussion today. AI is such a common term. We hear it thrown around all the time. It's become part of our common language when we either are sitting in the reading room or even discussing things around the family dinner table. But not so often we pause to think about what it actually means, what it's actually doing, and how it's transforming the practice of medical imaging. It's interesting when you look back on the explosion of AI across medical imaging. There was just this incredible excitement around it. All of these use cases that came to be this flurry of excitement and innovation in many, many different tools. But now we're really starting to step back, take a close look at what is going on, ask ourselves why we're doing what we're doing, and look at it carefully as we apply it to our clinical practice of medicine. Webinars like this are so important for us to take a step back and really think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how it's changing the way we deliver patient care. So when we think about moving from novelty to necessity and really defining our why and what we're doing and why we're doing it, it's really important to think about how we optimize our processes and everything from developing new tools to evaluating new tools to clinically implementing new tools across our workspace. So I hope you'll use this time to ask us questions to stimulate a lively discussion. And to really make us think critically about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where the future of AI is going in medical imaging. So with that, I'd like to launch a couple of poll questions just to get a sense of the audience today. If we could go ahead and launch those questions now, that would be great. So you'll see a couple of questions appear. If you could go ahead and answer those questions. Then both will give everyone a minute to answer, to click which answer applies to them, and then we'll look at these results together. I see some answers coming in. Please don't be shy. Go ahead and let us know what your thoughts are. We'll give everyone another minute or so because I see lots of responses coming in. Still a bunch of responses coming in. I'll wait till it slows down just slightly. All right, let's take a look at the first question. So the first question was, do you use AI in your practice? And we're going to close it with results. And hopefully I did this right. Can everyone see the answers, I'm hoping? So it looks like about a third of you, or 29%, say no, we don't use AI in our practice. About 50% are saying yes, but for research purposes. So they're not applying it to their regular clinical care. And 21% are saying yes for clinical care. So use of AI for clinical patient care, at least in this population right now, is still really research oriented, which is very interesting. Moving on to the next question, I'm going to go ahead and close with results. Hopefully everyone can see this now. We asked if you use AI, so for those minority doing clinical care, how is it paid for? So it looks like 36% say they pay for the software themselves. An equal percent, 36%, say they use the software under a trial or exchange for providing data. 14% say other. I would love to know what that is. If you'd love to put a comment in the chat, you could let us know. And then another 14% say that the institution does not use AI. So I think this is important because this really highlights the tremendous heterogeneity of adaptation and use across the practice of radiology, at least in the US and certainly globally from my experience. And this will really help launch us into our discussion. I think the looming question, though, and I'll jump to this for our panelists, that all of the residents and fellows challenge me with when I teach is, will AI replace radiologists? And really, what is AI? What's narrow? What's general AI? And is it going to take my job someday? So I'll ask them to chime in their thoughts and see what they think about this. Dr. Agarwal, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, first, I do want to actually comment on the results of the polling questions, because I do think that they're really interesting, especially if you compare the results to a survey that was conducted by the American College of Radiology about 15 months ago. So back then, when the question was asked as to how many people currently use AI in their practice for clinical or research purposes, it was approximately 30%. And this was a fairly large sample of 2,000, I think the largest survey ever conducted for AI users. And 30% compared to now 70%, even if that 70% is only 20% clinical, I think is not surprising, but is still really, really interesting, because I think we've seen this exponential growth in use where things have gone from this theoretical space of everyone's interested in learning about AI and everyone's heard about it and everyone's gone to the booths at RSNA, opposed to now, just 15 months later, where people actually have it on their workstations in front of them. So I just thought that was really cool to see that growth over time. Now, to the burning question about will AI replace radiologists? In my opinion, I don't think it will, and I think that this is probably a fairly accepted consensus at this point, that shouldn't be a concern for any radiologist out there. Just like the calculator never replaced accountants. It will be a tool that will hopefully allow us to practice better and at the top of our game, as opposed to performing a lot of the mundane tasks that a computer is better suited at doing than us, especially while AI remains narrow. Meaning that it, is specifically geared towards one or two tasks. I think that AI also has a potential to elevate what radiologists currently contribute to healthcare and to the clinical pathway overall by, adding value in terms of findings that right now as humans are, very difficult for us to do when it comes to quantitative or 3D or volumetric or, things that are just very tedious as humans, but very, very easy for computers. So I think there's a lot of potential there without it being threatening.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. Dr. Krishnan, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, the question's already been answered, I think, but instead I'll say ditto. So I love the Dr. Agawal's calculator accountant. So that's a great analogy, right? So I think, while to me it seems like accountants are human calculators, in reality they have to have a lot more knowledge to do their job than just adding, right? So adding is the measurement function that a computer can easily replace and can do better than most accountants, or certainly better than me. But they have so much more background knowledge required, and skills, people skills, and mathematical skills and knowledge to do their job. Similarly, a radiologist is a lot more than just making the finding, and computers can't even do that yet, right? So AI is struggling with that part, but they're getting pretty good at certain narrow cases. So general versus narrow radiology, or narrow AI. General AI has to be able to do all of the making of the findings on X-rays or CTs or MR, ultrasound, or all of it across our practice. And right now, there's no pathway to doing that. But even once they did that, that wouldn't replace the radiologist, because we do so much more. And I think we understand that. Someone who isn't a radiologist does not. So I don't fear that it's going to replace me. But there's more to it than that, right? So, I personally believe that imaging is going to always be at the center of healthcare. I do have some concern that radiologists don't always have to be at the center of healthcare. And so this is kind of an inflection point for us. And I think the most previous inflection point was PACS, right? So back when the healthcare, the team had to come down to the reading room in order to see their images, in order to get their report, we were clearly at the center of healthcare then. But then PACS came about, and that's an inflection point. Do we want to use PACS to elevate the value that we provide to a healthcare system, or do we want to use PACS to hide in our reading rooms and deliver quality and service, but not be in the center of healthcare anymore? AI is the same way. So we can embrace it, learn about it, and augment ourselves with it to elevate the care and quality we provide to the healthcare system and the referring clinicians and to our patients. Or we can hide behind it or allow other people to chip away at the edges and then displace us from the center of healthcare moving forward. So I'm not worried about it, but I do think we have to embrace it as technology, learn more about it, and augment ourselves with it in the future.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think now more than ever, it's critical for radiologists to really lead in the AI space, not only in the radiology world, but in the larger medical house of medicine and across the different spaces, both academic and private practice and industry. Our voices, I think, are really critical right now, which is why I'm so glad to see people participating in this webinar today. So let's say there's people listening in and they're like, well, that sounds really great. I'd love to be a leader in AI. I'm the head of my private practice, perhaps, and I want to use some AI. But there's so much out there. The whole workplace is flooded with different solutions. Certainly, as people wander RSNA coming up shortly with the AI showcase, there'll be a lot of different things to choose from. So what's some advice that the two of you can give for judging AI vendors and judging products that are currently in the market? Dr. Agarwal, would you like to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start again. So I think that it's a very interesting and obviously a very relevant question, because whether AI actually helps or hurts you probably has to do with how well it's, one, integrated into your workflow, and two, what its inherent performance accuracy is specific to your practice. And it's challenging because it's hard to know ahead of time how well a certain solution is going to work with your patient population, because there's so little information out there today as to how these applications were trained and what populations they were tested on, and the numbers that are available for their performance accuracy. Will that be the numbers that you see? So I think one, of course, is actually testing out the specific applications on your data. And there are a lot of tools out there to help with that process. So Of course, I work at Nuance, so I have to mention that, as part of the Nuance marketplace and their Empower tools, it helps you develop a data set from your own data that you can then use and test on a certain application, and then understand, okay, well, what should I expect to see in terms of false positives, false negatives? Do these numbers that I'm seeing match the numbers that are written in the public data about that application? And, therefore make some sort of assumptions as to whether it's going to work well or not. So I'll stop with that for now.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Dr. Krishnan, let me pass it to you. The simple question, are all these products the same? And how can you tell the difference between them?
So the very short answer is they're not. They're all going to say that they're great. I think they all think they're great, and I hope they do. Otherwise, they shouldn't be trying to come to market. But if you actually bake them off side by side in your clinical environment, which very few of us have the time and resources to do, you'll find a huge difference among them. So and that doesn't mean that you don't have the time to do that. There are a couple tips or tricks you can do to try to figure out. The first, if there's a similar like-minded practice to you, similar patient population, similar IT stack, and they're using the product, you can simply ask, do they find value in it? And that might get you most of the way there. It's not as good as putting it back into your own IT environment, but that certainly helps, right? If they tell you it's a terrible product and you trust that they're similar to you, then maybe that's a terrible product. They tell you it's great, then maybe that's worth looking into yourself. That's the first quick thing is, do they have any clients that you can look to as references that have a similar patient population and IT stack to you? The second thing, Dr. Agarwal mentioned that they need to be able to put it into your tech stack, right? And maybe that's not important at a pilot stage or early, but if you're going to put it into clinical practice, radiologists count clicks, steps, seconds, because we do it, hundreds of times a day. So if it's only 30 seconds, but you're doing 100 times, that's half an hour. And that's just one day that is half an hour. And then, suddenly you're losing time, not gaining time. It's not improving your workflow, it's disrupting your workflow. So any inherent advantage of technology is lost due to the workflow disruption. And most of us just simply won't do it. So regardless of how good it is, if we don't do it, it's not going to benefit the patient. And so are they willing to work and integrate it into your workflow? And if so, do they have examples of how they've done that already in your tech stack? That's another thing that I like to ask. The third thing, short of actually doing it into your patients itself to see if it's generalizable, you can ask what they do with outliers, right? So what have they done thus far? So a really good AI company knows it's slower to market to not throw out any outliers, right? So it's quicker to market, quicker to get a good number if you curate your data set and only do one scanner and one type of patient and one situation with one slice thickness. You'll get really good data that way, test data. But as soon as you put that in a generalizable population, it'll be terrible. A great AI company will take longer to produce that first data, but it'll be more robust. And it's more likely to get close to those numbers when they put it in your data set. So ask them what they do. Ask them how many different types of scanners they've used and what patient populations they've tested in. And that'll give you a better sense of whether in real world data situations, you can get anywhere close to that with your patients. Ultimately, Dr. Agarwal is right. Until you see it, you don't know it's true. But there are a few things you can do to test it out ahead of time.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting when you look at new technology, particularly disruptive technology like AI, there's potential for it to go either way, and it can either deepen healthcare inequities or lessen healthcare inequities, particularly when you talk about the use cases for AI in underserved populations to better facilitate more efficient patient care. And you've hit on a big problem, and that is the quality of the data, whether or not there's diversity in the data and heterogeneity in the data. And knowing that when you take this tool, you can apply it to a population and not deepen healthcare inequity in the process. And I wonder, Dr. Agawal, as you've come across looking at different data sets and thinking about how much the data, the raw data actually matters, how can you look at that? How can you evaluate that? How can we be responsible shepherds to making sure that our disruptive technology lessens healthcare inequity instead of deepens it?
Yeah, I think that's another really, really great question, and something that we need to keep at top of mind whenever we're talking about AI, especially since so much of it is a black box to the user. And I would say that it's really difficult because there isn't that much information available. Unfortunately, if you look at the FDA summaries, which is really the only publicly facing information on most of these solutions, very few of them list out the relevant info in terms of patient demographics that were used for testing or training their algorithm. Some of them do, but it's rare for it to be very complete and very thorough. So I think that there is a lot that as professional societies that we can do to encourage this information. I know the ACR is definitely trying to get out there and as part of the AI Central database that they have, list out this type of information, solicit this information from AI vendors and list it. But I think that we've seen from all the research publications out there that there is no question that we need this information to make sure that inequities aren't deepened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to take it one step further. A lot of patients, when you have the discussion about healthcare inequity, and I absolutely think that patients should be involved in that discussion, not just physicians, patients will perceive healthcare inequity not just in terms of the technology and the data that's being applied to them, but in terms of the team that's working with that technology. I'm really fortunate to work with Dr. Krishnan at Radiology Partners, and in our work, diversity is something that's really important to us because patients will look at the team of partners working on these solutions, and if there's lack of diversity in that team, patients will perceive that as a healthcare inequity, which it is. And I think that as we rise as leaders in AI, diversity is tremendously important. We know that diverse teams perform better as a business case. They come up with more creative solutions that are then better applied to a diverse patient population. And I know, Dr. Krishnan, you are heavily involved in sort of the clinical workings of how we adopt AI and move it across the practice. And I wonder if you'd like to talk about how important it is to have diversity of voices in those conversations so that the solutions we're coming up with fit the patient's needs.
I think it's important. And I think it's also important that diversity be a lot of different things, right? So diversity of experience and stakeholder. One thing I realize, if you ask a room of radiologists what they want in their AI solution, they're going to say, I want things that make me more efficient. And I think that's fair. That's fine. But if you ask a room of patients what they want, they're going to say, I want something that makes it, can you make radiology more compassionate, or can you make it more accurate, right? It has to do with healthcare executives what they want, and it's going to be about things like, can you reduce patient leakage and improve retention? So every stakeholder needs to be represented in these conversations, and that's important. It's important to realize there's a lot of value inside and outside radiology throughout the healthcare value chain. And how do we ensure that all these perspectives and needs are being met? Because radiology touches so much. It's not just, touching us, but it's touching the patients and everyone else there. And I do think we want to make sure that we're valuing everyone's perspective when we look at these technologies. Ultimately, for this to succeed, we have to make sure that everyone gets value out of this. And those are the solutions that are going to help us move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I think as we're moving forward aggressively, all hands on deck working, one of the things that's really important to think about is burnout. We often think about the impact on the patient, the impact on the hospital system, the impact on everything that's going on surrounding patient care, but there's still a radiologist at a workstation using these tools. And AI has the ability to either lessen burnout or increase burnout, especially if it's not working with the tech stack, which you touched upon, Dr. Krishnan. So we can start with you first. What do you think about the impact of these tools on burnout? And what have you seen, since you're more in the private practice world, about the impact on our radiologists as we start to apply it into our clinical use?
So that's a great question. So just within our larger radiology partners organization, so we feel like this may be the biggest use case for AI within our practice, is actually to help reduce physician burnout going forward, right? So a lot of those tedious tasks that radiologists are currently required to do, but they don't actually require radiology training, you can offload that on something that actually does it better on a technology tool, which AI is simply a technology tool. And so at the end of the day, whether you're doing more work or not doing more work, it makes you feel better about yourself, like you've accomplished more, or you're less fatigued and you're better recharged to come back the next day and do it again and take great care of patients. And so to do that, you do have to put it into the workflow of the radiologist, right? Because every time you step outside your workflow, that's one more stress. But a lot of these tasks, picking up the phone, doing these things, checking the chart, those are outside your workflow. So can we remove those tasks, embed it all into a single interface so that you can still take great care of your patients, but not step out of the things that you enjoy doing? And so, yeah, I think when we start measuring these, you measure how much they like the tool, how accurate is the tool, and how they feel at the end of the day. And it's that third thing that we didn't expect is really being impacted by some of these. And so for us to move forward with any partner, they have to be willing to put it into the software package for us. If it's outside of it, it's going to really harm that third category of how the radiologist feels at the end of the day. Every time they step out of it, it just takes a little bit away from their enjoyment. And they're a little bit less ready to take care of patients the next day.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dr. Agarwal, how do you feel it's impacted the experience of actually being a radiologist? How has it changed what it feels like for a radiologist to wake up, do their excellent work, facilitate patient care? It really is changing the way we practice medicine, but how? And do you think it's been a negative or a positive?
I think it's too early to tell. I don't think that there's enough AI in use because even if, say, 20%, as responded today, are using it clinically, I would say at the most they're using one, maybe two different applications. And I think that when we are at our steady state or equilibrium, since these are narrow AI solutions, it'll probably be 15 to 20 different applications that are being used by any radiologist on any given day. So I think that it's yet to be seen how it impacts us. I completely agree with everything Dr. Krishnan said, though, that the key will be that it has to do so seamlessly. It has to be in your environment, and it has to mean fewer clicks and fewer and less time staring at the screens that don't matter, and maximizing the amount of time that you get to spend staring at the images and not the other things. So I think that it's yet to be seen, and part of it will be dependent upon how the AI is integrated and how your practice goes about integrating it. So hopefully the administrators who are helping with this process will recognize this and understand that. And it won't be like it was 10, 15 years ago when we had 3D post-processing stations and we had to go to a separate workstation to do these things. I mean, I don't think that anyone would tolerate that. So.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think this is a great time to acknowledge one of the comment questions from one of our audience members today. It says, just a comment, the audience attending this webinar may be different from the participants on the mentioned ACR survey, so the results on the AI usage may be not comparable. And I think that that's true of any sort of non-scientific study. The results may not be comparable, but I think it's interesting today for the purposes of our discussion and a nice tiny little lens to at least acknowledge that there's a lot of heterogeneity and there's a lot of differences as to what's going on across the board. And it's nice to frame our discussion in that way to know we're talking to a diverse group of people. I think this may be a great time to launch our next survey question. So if we could go ahead and launch the next question, and I will open up my polling as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move us along and we'll show the results. So some interesting and some surprising to me. Neuroradiology, which I'm a little bit partial to, I'm a neuroradiologist, is one of the top ones, as well as mammography. And we have seen some phenomenal AI rise in these two cases, particularly with stroke and neuroradiology. It has a lot of different use cases, particularly with lines and tubes. I'm surprised not to see any abdominal imaging or MSK imaging. Maybe we just don't have any enthusiastic MSK or abdominal radiologists. Ultrasound maybe is under abdominal to some extent. Chest, cardiovascular, again, I'm surprised this one's a little bit less given the pulmonary nodule trial and interest over that. And then interventional radiology, I don't know, maybe not a surprise given it's so procedural based. But let me throw it to our panelists. Any thoughts on this survey results?
Yeah, I don't think it's too surprising. I think that this mirrors what is commercially available today. So if you look at the 130 or so commercially available applications in radiology, about the top three are neuro, followed by chest, followed by mammography. So I think this pattern makes sense. I think it's possible that a lot of the chest stuff might be under general or plain films. Chest x-ray, like you said, lines and tubes, could be splitting that vote a little bit. But yeah, I think that this might be reflective of just what's available on the market. As an abdominal radiologist, of course, I think that there's a lot of potential in abdominal, especially because of the number of incidental findings. Obviously an abdominal CT or abdominal image of any sort has many, many organs on it, as opposed to neuro, where there's, the brain, and less so more tangential findings, potentially to whatever the reason is that the patient came in. So I think that there's a lot of potential for AI to help, kind of on the edges of the film. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because this question was all subspecialty based. But of course, AI is not just image recognition. There's so many other use cases along the patient experience life cycle that have to do with protocol and your dictation and follow-up or scheduling or even contrast administration. And let me ask you, Dr. Krishnan, what do you feel about the results? And do you think they would have been different if we had included other elements of the patient exam life cycle?
Yeah, so I'm also, this fell in with, I think probably what happened was our vendors reached out to people and asked, where do you want to be interested in? And then they put their resources into answering that. So I think this probably matches the market, and it doesn't surprise me, with neuro and breast imaging being at the top. No, I think it's a good response, and it does show the interest right now. But it does lend to itself to the question that was asked here in the chat, which is, how does a group decide, what do they should consider first? And for me, if I were going to pick, I would look inward at my own group and decide, what problem am I trying to solve? Where is the most inefficiency that I'm trying, or what is the biggest clinical problem that I think I could overcome? Ideally, with an FDA-approved solution, right? So there are all these things on the market. A lot of them aren't FDA approved. So if you want a non-FDA approved solution, you can do it under an IRB. But if it's your first dipping your first toe in the water, I'd probably go for an FDA approved solution that is solving a problem you're having in practice. So one example, neuroradiology. Perhaps you have a lot of non-neuroradiologists reading high-end neuroradiology imaging, and you want the benefit of one of these solutions to help you. Or perhaps you're already subspecialized, but you want to catch these quicker, triage them faster, whatever it is. So you pick out what the problem you're trying to solve for, and then see what the solutions are in the market that address that problem. That's probably how I would do it. But most people are looking at neuro or breast imaging. Because tomo, for example, you have more tomo now. It's great for the patient. It takes longer to read. And so if you use one of these solutions, they suggest that they will help speed up your efficiency. Now to your second question, would it be different if you were considering the rest of the imaging life cycle? I think it would be, right? Because a lot of the questions you have about, what happens once you have the order, or once you're assigning who should be reading the study, or what you should do once you've made the finding and now you want to get the referring clinician on the phone, want to make sure the patient gets their follow-up. That's all very different. A lot of that stuff, I think body imaging or abdominal imaging that rise to the top in a lot of those situations. But it's really hard for these for the AI to actually make the finding. Thankfully for me and Dr. Agarwal, we have great staying power in radiology. I don't know about you neurorads, but for us, it's just, there's so many things to keep track of on those images. And so no matter how many AI vendors you're going to use to look at a body CT, you're going to still need us. That's okay. You can read some body CTs too. We'll keep you. But for the rest of the life cycle, that's where it's also really hard to get our protocols right. It's really hard to track down all those incidental findings. Really hard to make sure those patients come back. And so if you're looking at the rest of the life cycle, I expect that abdominal imaging will start to rise to the top, because there's so much more to it than just looking at the images. There's a lot to radiology besides just making a finding.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate and totally agree with those thoughts. There's a question in the chat that I think is perfect for Dr. Agawal. It says, should the suggestion to test the model performance on one's own data be performed before you buy the product or after? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think that you need to perform this type of testing before you purchase the product. And I think that all the AI vendors out there probably understand that at this point too, that people aren't going to buy a product blindly without having tested it on their data. And I think that they're probably all very willing to help in that process. As I mentioned, if you go through one of the platforms, such as a Nuance Marketplace, then that can help you with that process of developing these data sets so that you can test out the model, whether it's for a certain amount of time or just have these data sets prepared based on your historical data and run it on the algorithms so that you can then, assess the results and make that decision.
Absolutely. And I think that this is a great segue into our next audience poll question, which talks about actually buying the products. So if we could go ahead and launch the next poll. Oh, you know what? Actually, I'm sorry. That was our other question. My bad. Let's continue with this question. Which areas do you think AI could be most useful in radiology? And this is not only in buying, but also gets to the heart of what Dr. Krishnan was talking about in terms of the other use cases. Sorry. I see lots of results rolling in. Improve workflow, triage critical cases, improve radiologist accuracy or efficiency or results follow-up. So these are all the different parts of the imaging life cycle of how a patient experiences medical imaging. And the results are rolling in. Still a few trickling in. I think you guys will be very excited to see these results. So I'm going to go ahead and close with results. And everyone should be able to see this now. So I think this is really interesting and really exciting in terms of AI applications across medical imaging. Because as you can see, yes, image identification or diagnostic type AI is really important. But everyone believes that all of the different points of the imaging life cycle are important, and it's actually pretty evenly split amongst them, except for results communication follow-up, which I personally believe is very, very important. But let me go ahead and turn it over to our panelists and see what they think about these results.
I think that it's really interesting, and I totally agree. It's nice to see actually that it's evenly split, almost saying that AI could be helpful potentially in all of these areas, probably dependent on the type of AI and all the things we've already talked about, and how well it's integrated and how well it's actually performing. But I do want to actually segue in terms of these specific types of AI solutions back to one of the other questions that had been written in the chat about how do you know where to start if you wanted to purchase something. And I think one of the most challenging things is actually just seeing what's out there and how do you know what's out there in terms of AI solutions that might triage critical cases or AI that's out there that might improve accuracy versus efficiency. So I just wanted to make sure all of the viewers are aware of two resources that are out there. First, the FDA actually has a database out there of all FDA cleared solutions. And the ACR, as I mentioned earlier, also has a database of all the FDA cleared solutions called AI Central. And the ACR database is searchable now. As of this week, they've added the option that you can search based on the type of AI. So whether it's a triage application or whether it's a diagnostic application or whether it's just, quantification. And of course you can search by subspecialty. So this way you can, really hone in on what the different options are if you decide that you want to look at what sort of options you have for helping your neuroradiology department in improving workflow, for example. So just pointing those out for people as there might be useful resources.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for pointing those out. Very, very useful, particularly when people feel overwhelmed in terms of an initial evaluation of what they're looking at. Dr. Krishnan, what do you think about these results? Did they surprise you?
So this didn't surprise me. This implies to me we have a lot of radiologists here. So I would expect that radiologists would pick out workflow, accuracy, and efficiency as their top choices. The interesting thing is that healthcare executives would choose the other two. So healthcare executives all want to solve the communication follow-up problem, just so you know. So a lot of times we think that we've made the finding, we've put the finding in the report. If it's critical value, we've made that phone call to the first clinician, probably the ED clinician, we're done. But that's not always the case, right? So there are, well, the healthcare executive would tell you that's not the case, but they would think that the final value has been achieved or the care has been delivered when that patient returns for that follow-up or when that procedure happens. So I'll give you an example, PE, so PE response team. So I find a PE, it's a critical value. I'll call the ED physician, I tap myself on the back. Then the ED physician calls the admitting physician, who calls the primary critical care, who calls the IR physician sitting next door to me. But that takes like 4 or 5 hours, right? I mean, I could just walk next door, couldn't I? And so, how do you squish that 4 to 5 hours into 15 minutes? Or, I find a non-critical value like a AAA, and I recommend the AAA, and I probably don't, AAA follow-up. I probably don't bother calling anyone because it's a AAA follow-up. It's not a critical value. The hospital executive would tell you that the care for that patient doesn't end until they come back for that follow-up, ideally in her facility, right? So she wants you to come back and get the follow-up in her healthcare system. And so how do we ensure that happens? Because the ED physician who gets that report, they're the ED physician, right? So their job is to make sure that person, all the critical stuff is taken care of. So they pass that along to the primary care physician. So someone needs to take ownership of that. So that's the biggest thing for them. The second biggest thing is that triaging. So right now, we read cases in order. There's stat and inpatient and outpatient, but you read them in order. And if you knew that this person was about to die, or you could really help this one person, you'd pull them out of order. And AI, I think, helps us with that, right? So we have techs who will call us if they see a critical finding, or you have an ED physician who will call you and say, hey, can you read that one next? That person's really ill. But wouldn't it be great if AI could do that and could resort our patients for us? And even though the order is routine, we could read it stat because there's actually something really important on that study. And so I think those are the two use cases that our colleagues would ask us to put first. So all these are important. I think they're all part of the package that's going to help us deliver more value going forward.
Absolutely. I think the value proposition is rapidly evolving, and it's so important that we own that conversation in talking about the value that AI brings to us. There's an interesting question that we were all discussing in preparing for this webinar, and it has to do with the classic hype curve. So for those of you that are unaware of the hype curve, it talks about sort of the initial adoption of AI, the rapid excitement, and then the sort of trough of disillusionment as we kind of realize what we're actually working with, and then sort of move into a slow plateau state of really refining the tools that we're working with. And there's a lot of debate as to actually where we're at in this hype curve. And maybe we're all in a little bit of a different spot. But let me throw it to the panelists and ask you, where do you think we're at in terms of the hype of AI as it's rapidly evolving across our industry? And do you think we're starting to get some traction as we move from these research uses into actual clinical implementation? So I'll start with you, Dr. Agawal.
It's a little bit of a mixed bag. At first I want to say that I think we're still on the way up. There's still so much hype. You would have thought that from 2016 to now that maybe we'd start to plateau, or, we've started to see some of the truth of what the AI is as opposed to what the promise was. So, okay, well, maybe it doesn't actually work with 98% accuracy as we might have thought it would based on, the testing data that was released. Or if you look at all the publications out there where I feel like these headlines are always out there saying, oh, look, AI performed better than the physician. So there's obviously disillusionment when in practice we know that just isn't happening today. But at the same time, there's still just so much hype because I think everyone understands that there is potential. I think the hype is just different now. The hype isn't, okay, this is going to make radiologists obsolete. I don't think the hype is that now this computer is going to change the way that radiology is performed altogether. I think the hype now is, wow, we can really develop tools that help radiologists in terms of efficiency. We can really develop tools that are opportunistic AI applications and solutions that really add value to the patient's care by delving into information that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, whether it's body morphometric sorts of things such as abdominal fat composition or abdominal muscle mass composition. These are things that tell us so much information about the patients that otherwise we just never would have known, but the information was always right there. So I think there's still a lot of hype. It's just changed, and the hype is probably more aligned with reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes complete sense. What are your thoughts, Dr. Krishnan?
I'm going to agree with Dr. Agawal again. So I was wondering about this up front, whether I should say that we were on our way up or whether we're starting to go down. I do think it's a matter of perspective, because I think there are some radiologists who are like, this is all hype, and I think we're starting to enter that trough of disillusionment. But I don't think the industry is that way. I think overall we're still on the way up. We haven't met max hype yet. And the hype has started to reach, other physicians across the healthcare spectrum and healthcare executives, right? So you're starting to see your colleagues in pulmonology saying like, hey, can we get this new AI pulmonary nodule thing? Or, hey, can we get this new stroke tool and for neurosurgeons or whatever? So it's still spreading is the point. It's still infectious. It's still contagious. And you're starting to get some results, but it's not fully grounded yet. So, peering into the future, I think some of these companies are going to drop off because they're not going to show the results. So when you start testing them against each other, it's easy to be hype and say you're great when you have nothing to compare it to. At this point, you're starting to be able to compare them side by side. And when you do that, those that actually do help the radiologist, who do help the patient, who do solve some of these needs, will still be around to get us through that trough and to help us, actually achieve something going forward. And the rest will find, well, it didn't quite work out. Let me apply these AI machine learning to some other industry. And there are lots of other industries, and so I'm sure they'll find something else to do. It's a difficult problem to solve. It's a great technique, AI, machine learning. It's a great tool. But yeah, I still think we're on the way up.
I couldn't agree more. We have less than 10 minutes left. It's been a great discussion. If I could, I'd like to get just a little bit personal for a minute. There are a lot of people listening to this that maybe are not involved in AI efforts, but would love to be. It can seem very, very intimidating, particularly to listen to us talk with experience and converse about all these different challenges. It can be intimidating to figure out how to make that first step into becoming a leader into this field. For myself, I found a lot of education and mentorship inside of organized radiology. And I know in particular, the RSNA has some fantastic opportunities for people at all different training levels to get involved. But I'd love to pitch it to both of our panelists today to talk about how they would suggest that someone who wants to get involved in AI but is not yet could get involved. So Dr. Agarwal, would you like to start?
I think that there's a ton of ways, and I think organized radiology or the professional societies is a great way to start. And RSNA, ACR, and even the subspecialty societies, I think now everyone has resources available when it comes to learning about AI, and even when it comes to the solutions that might be out there for you to try out. One particular one that I'd point to is the AI lab on the ACR DSI site. That's a great way to really learn about AI and how you as a radiologist you can even, make an algorithm yourself on the AI lab site. It walks you step by step through how to, train and test an algorithm. So it's a great way to just start learning about the process.
Fantastic. And Dr. Krishnan, you live more in the private practice side of the world. What are some advice that you could give to people listening in that would love to bring AI to their practice, but are just getting their feet wet for the first time?
Yeah. So, the first thing, anyone can reach out to me, right? So anyone who has questions or concerns or thinking about this, you're welcome to reach out, and I'm happy to answer those questions. But but I think it helps to be inquisitive, right? So all these, they're still trying to sell you something. So every group, every AI vendor has a product. They want to sell you something, but ultimately, you know what is best for your group and your patients. And so that's how I got involved. So I'm not smart enough to understand how these AI products work, and that's okay. I understand radiology better than they do. So I know what questions we're trying to solve, and whether or not, once I understand kind of how their product works, I understand whether or not that's going to solve or meet the needs of my group or my practice. And that's the role that I play. The role I played initially, and then suddenly I became that guy, right, for the practice. And so you start to learn more and more about what they do, and hopefully they learn a little bit about what we do, which is important, right? Because I want these vendors to know what radiology is, what we do, how important that is for patient care, so that they can learn to tune their algorithms to solve these problems that matter to us and our patients. And so that's all that it took, right? I just became involved with them for the purpose of bettering our patient care venture. And that allowed me to discriminate between which of these vendors are actually going to help us and which of them aren't. But it also helps out to find people at other great practices, like both of you, who can help you lead through that process, because it kind of jumpstarts you. It seems really hard. It seems like AI is really complicated, and it is, but you don't really need to understand it. You don't have to be able to create it yourself to be able to decide, is this going to help my patients or not?
Absolutely. I totally agree. Keeping patients at the center, the heart of everything we do is probably the most important message for me to get across for you today. There is one more question that popped up in the chat, and perhaps we could use it for each of you to answer briefly and then lead into any closing thoughts that you may have for us today, since we have just a few moments left. Let me read the question. It said, should regulatory standards be implemented for these types of products, including production process, by asking for AI to be compared to most experienced radiologists, and post-production with the implementation of a reporting system for post-market issues? I think this really gets into where we're trying to move with all of this, and that is clinical adaptation of AI and really seeing the way it can transform patient care. So I'll let that be a launching pad into each of you sharing your closing thoughts for us today. Dr. Krishnan, we can start with you.
Sure. So it's actually really interesting, because I've been asked about this. So where does the output of the AI go? Is that going to be in the permanent medical record? Who is liable? So right now, the answer is, and I think probably everyone here knows this, the radiologist is liable. The AI is not. You can't sue the AI, to my knowledge, as of yet. And so at least these are state liability things. So maybe there's some states where that's different, but in most situations, it's the physician who's liable. And so the AI does not necessarily, the output of the AI does not necessarily have to be in the permanent medical record, right? So the work product of the RAD ends up in the permanent medical record, both in the report and in the PACS. The work product of the AI is simply there to assist the radiologist. Now, that does go through an FDA approval process, and that actually means that it doesn't continue to improve and adapt after release. So once the FDA product is released, the AI stops learning actively at the time of the FDA release. They can still continue to gain data based on whether you're agreeing with it or not if they want to, but they can't put that into a live learning environment. At some point, if they want to do a revision for that product, they can ask. They have to get that FDA approved, and they can put out a revision. But you get a static product that's been approved that isn't continuously learning, even though it's one of the benefits of AI. So that's how it works currently. Should there be regulation? I'm sure they should. And as soon as you can start doing AI, there's going to be lots of regulation around that. Until then, it's always going to be done under the auspices of the radiologist. I will disagree with AI at times, and that's okay. That's my job to decide what is right for that patient, and I'm assuming all of the liability for that disagreement. But ultimately, I'm embracing this because good AI plus me is only going to make it better. I'm not perfect. AI is certainly not perfect, but together we can get closer to that in service of our patients. And I want to make sure Dr. Agawal has time too. So thank you guys very much for this.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic. I love good AI plus me is better. It's so simple and it's so true. Dr. Agawal, please.
Well, I think that it's a really interesting question, because I think that the entire regulatory landscape around AI solutions in radiology is one, it's a moving target, and two, it's incredibly difficult to know exactly where you are in that movement right now. It's not easy to understand what the regulatory process is. And I think, to be fair to the FDA, I think it's very, very challenging to say what the best way is to regulate these products and still make it to where it's not this huge barrier to entry or barricade for technology to actually advance. I do think there needs to be more post-market surveillance, and that part needs to play a much greater role in the entire approval and regulatory process of this type of software. Right now, a lot of the precedent for how the clearance happens is through software as a medical device. So it's really based on medical device and medical device recalls as the main indicator for, oh, this isn't working. And I don't think that that's going to be the flag that we see if AI isn't working, because as Dr. Krishnan talked about, it may not even be in the record. You don't even know it didn't work because the radiologist is overreading it anyway. So I know we're out of time, so I just want to say I think it's a very fascinating question. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. But I've been, very happy to be here today and talk about this, and anyone's welcome to reach out to me for any questions or further discussion as well. So thank you so much.
Fantastic closing remarks. Thank you. And I really do hope today is just the start of a conversation, not an encapsulated single instance. And please feel free to reach out to any of us or continue to have the conversation amongst our whole community. I would like to thank today's faculty for sharing their expertise, and certainly Nuance Communications for sponsoring today's webinar. To our audience, thank you for attending today's webinar, and we all hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.